for your exchange and for your interest on this important topic. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you need help troubleshooting during this presentation, please email info@brycs.org or use the chat box to the left of your screen. Today's webinar will be recorded and archived and made available 24 hours after the event. Registrants will receive a follow-up email with a recording, a copy of the slides, and any supplemental materials along with an evaluation. We have over 100 people on today's call, so we've muted everyone to keep the background noise at a minimum. A Q&A session will be held at the end of the presentation, so please, again, use the chat box to the left to submit your questions, and any unanswered questions will be posted to the BRYCS blog. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Hillary Chester. Hillary is the Director of the Anti-Trafficking Program and Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Dr. Chester has over 12 years of experience working directly and in national positions with vulnerable migrants, including victims of trafficking, refugees, and unaccompanied children, program management, social science research and evaluation, and development and delivery of training to national and international entities, including law enforcement, advocacy, and service providers. She consults to HHS and ORR on trafficking cases. She was elected chair of the Texas Consortium of Refugee Providers, has chaired both local and national human trafficking coalitions and task forces, and has served on multiple advisory groups and steering committees in the fields of human trafficking and migrant protection. She received her doctorate in anthropology from Southern Methodist University. Thank you for joining us today, Hillary.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank everybody who's on the call. I appreciate your interest in this topic. I'm going to spend the hour that we have ahead of us talking about a study that we conducted here at USCCB, looking at how our Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Foster Care Program adapted some of their programming to serve foreign national child victims of trafficking. And so we found that our programs were making some adaptations to their service model and providing some specialized services for those child victims of trafficking. And we think that this would be a really a good model, and some of the adaptations would be applicable to other foreign national victims of trafficking that are in residential community-based programs like foster care, as well as for U.S. citizen, essentially domestic minor victims of trafficking who are often in out-of-care placements like foster care, group homes, transitional living programs. And so we wanted to really talk about some of the outcomes that we saw among our child victims of trafficking related to safety, permanency, well-being, and then some of, again, those program adaptations that our programs found were really useful in helping those children achieve positive outcomes. Okay, oops, let me find my next button. Okay, so the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor Program, hopefully many of you are familiar with this program. If not, I know we have a lot of resources on BRYCS. Essentially, it's a specialized foster care program here in the U.S. for foreign national children who arrive either as refugees without a parent or caregiver at the time that they are resettled, or children who arrive in the U.S. and then are granted political asylum, special immigrant juvenile status, or are identified and certified as child victims of human trafficking, as well as some Cuban and Haitian entrant children. Because this is a program that's specifically for these foreign national categories of children, it's a federal program. It's been around about 30 years or more, but the programs are licensed in their individual states, and so they are following all of the local foster care regulations, standards, and practices. There are two organizations that administer these URM programs, us, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, as well as the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services program. The URM program we think is pretty unique because it really does take the best of out-of-home community-based care, like foster care framework, and then adapts it to meet the needs of migrating or foreign national children. And so there's a real emphasis on cultural competency and an emphasis on being very child-centered and trauma-informed. This is just a quick map of where our programs and LIRS's programs are located. We're not in every state. We're pretty broad. One note is that we only have our programs in states where youth are able to stay in care at least until their 21st birthday, because many of the youth arrive when they're adolescents or teenagers, and so we want to make sure they have as much time in a structured care program as possible to prepare them for that independent adult living. Some of the services that are typical of other foster care programs are certainly present in our URM program. Our affiliates, their staff are always recruiting and training foster families. They do placement of the youth, matching them with appropriate foster families or group care. We encourage them to hire staff who have the same cultural and linguistic capacities as the children that they're serving. Certainly the kids are receiving access to medical and dental care, mental health services. Legal services for some of these kids is important, again, because they may be trying to adjust their immigration status. And then often education assistance is a real key. Like other youth in out-of-care placement, sometimes there's been disruptions in their education history and they need some extra attention to catch back up. Some ways that the program's a little bit unique or different from a typical foster care program is that that extra attention to the cultural orientation, helping to integrate these kids into not just a new neighborhood or a new community, but a new culture as well, and recognizing that these kids are coming from other countries and that we want to be able to preserve their ethnic and cultural and religious identity. Again, some of these kids are arriving from refugee situations. Others have migrated themselves to the U.S. And so there's a real emphasis in trying to identify and find family, whether the family's here in the U.S. and we can reunify the kids or introduce them to family they may not have met so they can form relationships with family here in the U.S. In other cases, it may be that the families are overseas and we work with other international partners to help try to locate families and work on international reunifications in some ways. Most of our programs have adult refugee resettlement programs in the area, and so we try to help pair them up so that the youth are spending time with their own ethnic communities, the same kind of country of origin or ethnic group of origin that they're coming from in a larger community setting. And then certainly, again, these are mainly kids coming to us in adolescence, and so we want to make sure that they're being prepared for independent adult living, and that's a real strong focus of the program. As I mentioned, we did a study where we looked at our program, our network, our affiliate of URM programs, and really wanted to see how they served victims of human trafficking in particular, and to contrast how they served those youth compared to the typical refugee caseload or the asylum or Cuban Haitian entrant youth in their programming. Because what we found in doing kind of literature reviews and attending conferences on child welfare and Foster Family Treatment Association conferences, there is a growing body of research and evidence-based practice research on serving victims of trafficking, child victims of trafficking in particular, but there isn't a lot of long-term studies because it's a relatively new field. It's relatively new for these U.S. citizen children in particular to even be recognized as victims of trafficking and be served in specialized programs. And we thought we have this time depth where we've been serving foreign national children for at least over a decade, and we could actually maybe provide to the field some more long-term results in looking at our youth's outcomes, and then again what it was about our programs that they adapted their service models to accommodate the needs of this somewhat specialized population of the child trafficking victims. Okay, so what we wanted to do was look at some trends among the individual outcomes for the child victims of trafficking, again really looking at the kinds of specialized services that they needed that were provided to them, and then what it was, again, internally that the programs were doing in order to staff these cases perhaps differently, recruit family differently, pairing up the youth with family, pairing up the youth with staff differently to make sure that everybody was having a more successful outcome. And we did find that there were some kind of key adaptations, which I'll describe later in this presentation. So our study included all of the youth who were identified as child victims of trafficking at the point that they were placed or referred to our program over a 7-year period. So youth in our program between 2004 and 2011. We had to kind of kick out some cases that we just didn't have enough documentation because maybe they'd come in right at the tail end of that time period. So we ended up with a sample of 67 cases. We looked at their basic demographics, their history of the trafficking, what kind of trafficking had they experienced prior to being placed in the program, and then again looking at each child in that sample's outcomes that were related to their safety, permanency, and well-being. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't have in front of me, and just off the top of my head don't remember what the gender breakdown was, but I do have some slides of the country of origin, the kind of trafficking they experienced, their age at the point of enrollment, how long they were trafficking, and who they were trafficked and exploited by. So the country of origin, we broke that down by also the kind of sex trafficking they experienced. And we did see some trends in some of the countries where sex trafficking was a little bit more prevalent in some countries, not really prevalent among the children from other countries. And then some cases where the youth had been exploited both in a sex and labor setting. And so those were cases perhaps where a child was in a home providing primarily domestic service work, domestic work in someone's home, but they were forced to also provide sexual acts and perform sex acts with somebody in the home, as well as some cases where the youth were primarily exploited in the commercial sex sector, perhaps working in a bar or cantina or in a prostitution setting, but then also at times compelled to do other kinds of labor. Cleaning offices was one example that we had, other kinds of labor, childcare, for example, in another case that I can think of off the top of my head. So we did see just a few patterns. It seemed that the sex trafficking cases in our caseload were primarily occurring among the youth that we had coming out of Mexico and Central America, as you'll see on the chart, but also a case from Sierra Leone. The age at the point that the youth were referred and enrolled in our program, here you can see the average was about 16 and a half years old. Again, mainly adolescents. We had one very young individual down in the 12 or 13 range, a couple at 14. And so by and large, though, they were adolescents, late teens. But we did look at some of those cases to see what the circumstances were of the much younger kids. And in most cases, those were youth that were in in-home domestic work settings. One, though, was a sex trafficking case. The length of time in the trafficking situation, this we were very curious about because we thought there would probably be, we imagined, an association between the length of time that the children, the youth, were exploited and to some degree the amount of trauma that they might have experienced. Imagining that the longer someone is in a very exploitative, very abusive situation, the more trauma they may have therefore experienced. And so we thought that that would be an indicator of maybe their level of need and the kind of interventions, the severity of their trauma would lead to more needs, greater needs, perhaps more specialized needs. Okay. The relationship to the trafficker was a key indicator or measure that we wanted to look at, and then we kind of tabulated that with the country of origin. I'll first to talk about the relationship. That we were very curious about because there are certainly going to be implications in those cases related to family reunification options. Obviously, if a family member was complicit or contributed to the trafficking, then we would have some real concerns and would have to really approach family reunification very differently than someone whose family was not at all part of the trafficking scheme or may have even be at risk themselves as a result of the child being extracted from the trafficking situation. So, of course, family reunification options. but also just thinking again about the child's more mental health and well-being needs and development needs, that we suspected based on some literature that we have seen that when someone is exploited and abused by a close family member or someone from their community, a trusted adult from the community, that betrayal can sort of result again in a little bit more of a traumatic, breaking the trust, breaking the betrayal, and have a bigger impact on their ability to form healthy relationships going forward, their ability to reintegrate back into their community or into their family again. So we wanted to look at that very carefully. And what we found was that there were patterns among some of the youth and who the traffickers were. In a surprisingly high number of cases, the traffickers were people that these children or youth should have been able to trust, whether it was extended family. We saw several cases where uncles, aunts, cousins, in-laws, brother-in-law kind of situations, as well as individuals who they were in, however, dysfunctional romantic relationships with. And so if from the child's perception, this was an intimate partner, this was a romantic partner of theirs who then began exploiting them, certainly we counted that as a prior relationship. To contrast, then we had other scenarios and we saw other patterns where the youth were exploited by the smugglers, for example. So if they were smuggled into the U.S. and it may have been the smuggler who at the end of the journey doesn't release them to their family or just sort of release them on the U.S. side, but rather puts them to work or puts them in some other kind of exploitative situation, either to recoup the smuggling debt or just as a way of really just taking advantage of that youth. And so we saw cases like those where there really hadn't been a prior relationship. And we did see some trends then by country. So just as some interesting contrast, in Togo, the cases we had coming out of that country, by and large, that was all a sort of a recruiter who was going through towns and recruiting young people with promises of going to the U.S. and going to school, charging the families for this opportunity, and then at the U.S. side putting them to work in hair salons in particular and in other people's homes. So there hadn't been a relationship. It was someone traveling around looking to take advantage. In Mexico, we did find a really significant number of the youth from Mexico had been exploited by either extended family or several cases where the perception of the child or youth was that this was a romantic partner, a boyfriend, if you will. Honduras, we found most of those cases, for example, had been smugglers, and so they had been smuggled thinking that the relationship there would end, and yet the smugglers maintained control over them and exploited them. Okay, then I mentioned that we also wanted to look at outcomes, and we were trying to think of good indicators and measures of how these youth did, what their outcomes were. There were some forms that our programs had to complete on a monthly basis on the youth that included what we thought were some good indicators, such as the placement stability, so the number of moves from foster family to foster family or from group home to group home, whether or not they were granted immigration relief, whether or not they had an emotional connection to an adult, whether or not there was a family reunification option, and then in cases where youth were discharging from the program, what was the outcome? What form of discharge was this child going through? Were they aging out of the program or reunifying with family, and that's why they left the program? So we thought those were good indicators on this particular form that we were able to use. And some of our results include placement stability, which we found was interesting. We were able to look at some of the cases anecdotally, or in particular, the kids with a very high number of moves. As you can see, we had one youth who had 12 placement moves during their time in the program, another with 8. Those were two of the most just gauging from the case file notes and the trafficking history, some of the more traumatized children, some of the youth who had experienced some of the most severe abuse and exploitation while they were in the trafficking situation. And so it's very likely that their inability to form good relationships, their inability to just feel safe, and then some acting out around behaviors that may have been related to their trauma made it just difficult for them to kind of fit in and sort of settle with their placements. But the other youth we found didn't move too terribly many times. There were a couple of programs that had a protocol in place that all newly arriving children who had been identified as victims of trafficking started in a more supportive therapeutic group home, and then when they felt that the youth was ready and the youth felt that they were ready, they would then step down or move to a more traditional family-based foster home. And so in some cases, the placement move was a positive attribute rather than a breakdown situation. So we did try to look and see when were the moves positive and when were the moves perhaps how we'd characterize as negative. And one thing that we did see from this is that children, the youth, did much better when they didn't move often. And some of the youth who had some of the more positive outcomes overall were the youth that didn't move much, even in cases where kids were having behavioral issues. We had some cases where the youth were running away, going AWOL from the program. In some mainstream child welfare programs and some foster care programs, that would automatically require a placement move. That sometimes is a standard practice. In our programs, that wasn't the case, and we actually think that's a good practice, to not move youth simply because they've run away from a program. If they return to the program voluntarily, or if they are identified in the community and brought back to the program, if they can come back to the same program and kind of pick up where they left off and move forward, that's better than being moved to a new home and having to sort of form all new relationships and sort of find their place in the other residents in the home. And so we think reducing placement moves and increasing stability is a good practice. And to the degree that programs can accommodate that, even in cases where kids are perhaps acting out or running away and then returning, that would be a recommendation. The connection to an adult, this chart we looked at who the youth were connecting to. There is, you can see the bright yellow is 40.5% of the youth who, at least in the paperwork and case files, didn't have anyone. The case managers, for example, never noted that they made a good connection to an adult. So that is significant. These are kids where it is relationships that are being manipulated in trafficking, and so forming good relationships going forward does take a long time and is one of the areas that are impacted by the kind of trauma they experience. But as you can see, thankfully 60% roughly did form good connections with adults, including their foster parents, the case managers, and then other community members. And again, I noted at the beginning that our programs try to help connect these youth to their larger ethnic or sort of national origin communities through the Adult Refugee Program. And so that was a common community member connection, as well as adults from either a church or other religious-based, community, a mosque or a church by and large. And so sometimes that's where the youth were finding adults to connect with. And so we think that's a positive, and we were really pleased to see that at least 60% of the kids were able to form positive relationships. The law enforcement involvement, this is something that is incredibly important to foreign national youth. It's one of the ways that you can move a youth child victim of trafficking through the system in order to get the immigration status, the T visa, ultimately. So this is important. If you're familiar with the trafficking law here in the U.S., the federal law, youth under 18 don't have to cooperate with law enforcement, but when they cooperate, it does tend to move the case forward a little more quickly. And so this can be a good way to get immigration relief for the youth. But for U.S. citizens, there's not generally, of course, the immigration component, but working with law enforcement is something that does come up in these cases. because there is this whole criminal case around trafficking. Trafficking is a crime, and so there may be law enforcement involvement. And what we saw over time is that there was a decrease in the amount of follow-through and the amount of investigations that were opened for these youth. And for us, that was a little bit of a troubling trend, that the youth were identified as being a victim of trafficking, and then law enforcement really didn't pursue or continue investigating their case. And that can leave, again, it can slow down immigration relief. It can just make some other areas of their case moving forward a little more complicated. There can be some safety issues if the traffickers aren't identified and taken off the streets. There can be issues around wages or other compensation that they might be eligible for, where an investigation would make getting that kind of restitution much simpler. So we saw this as a somewhat troubling trend. The form of immigration relief that we saw, this is a breakdown of all of the youth. And so you can see that the T visa, which is purple, is a little over a third, but 41% at the time we did the study didn't have immigration relief, or it was still pending. And so for a foreign national youth, this can be a real barrier to kind of moving on and to feeling settled and to feeling stabilized. The uncertainty of not knowing if you're going to get a visa. Some of the visas that are available to youth enable them to bring their family into the U.S., others don't. And so all of this can kind of lead to just some instability and some barriers to just really feeling fully restored and healed for some of the youth. Some of the youth want some closure, and there are certainly instances where the seeking that kind of justice is actually very healing for youth. So I see there's a question here on the side about why law enforcement didn't follow up. What happened around 2008 is the process for getting the eligibility letter, which is issued by the Department of Health and Human Services, where Health and Human Services can determine that a child is a victim of trafficking and therefore eligible for services like Medicaid, TANF, URM Program, quite frankly. That used to be really tied to a law enforcement endorsement, that law enforcement would have to tell HHS, we looked into this case and we think it's trafficking, and then HHS would issue that letter. Many advocates, like our own organization, we didn't think that was great because that would create these barriers where law enforcement would take a long time to make that determination, or they might not make the determination, and then that held up the kids being able to access those services. So HHS changed their policy, and anyone with a professional background could then request the eligibility letter. So an attorney, a trained social worker, for example. So that meant that more kids were getting identified as victims of trafficking and being enrolled in these programs and getting the eligibility letter, but law enforcement wasn't necessarily engaged. And so then when the kids were placed in foster care, if we called law enforcement and said, hi, we're in a foster care agency in Arizona, but our child was exploited back in a different state, do you want to look into this case? They're like, no, that's just too complicated. So we saw that as one of the reasons. Okay. So I see the other question about whether the youth that didn't get immigration relief correlated with those who were struggling to make adult connections. And I'll be honest and say we tried to kind of cross-tabulate everything we could. I don't think we saw an overlap there necessarily. The large percentage of youth with the pending came back around to things like it just takes a really long time. It can take several years to finally ultimately get a T visa, especially if you don't have law enforcement endorsing it, and it's just your attorney filing for a T visa. And so many of the kids who were enrolled just hadn't gotten through the process. Again, that shift to HHS issuing the eligibility letter based on other people who are vetted and know what they're talking about and are reliable, saying this is a trafficking case. In those cases, it's possible that law enforcement never even had contact with the child. And so that meant that there was no evidence, if you will. And so when it came time to file for immigration relief, in some cases the attorneys, with no evidence for a T visa other than the child's story, they would pursue some other form like SIJS, which really only requires that you can demonstrate that a child was abused, abandoned, or neglected. And it's a different kind of threshold for meeting the requirements. So we saw a shift from T visas to SIJS, for example. Okay. The discharge disposition, we looked at how the youth who did leave the program during our study period left the program. We saw about 12 who left because they aged out, and then this is not the best chart, I'll be honest. So then of those 12, 8 left the program on their own and were independent. 3 left the program to go and live with biological family, and then 1 youth aged out at the point of being 23 years old and had to move on and presumably was prepared for that. The 5 youth who went AWOL, who ran away from the program, below that there's the 2 that contacted the program and said, hey, I'm okay, I'm with family, and then 3 didn't. So of the 5 who were AWOL out of the program, who didn't return to the program and ultimately had their cases closed and were discharged, 2 checked back in and said they were fine. So it's not the most ideal way to be discharged, but I think we were all pleased that they're okay and with family. In both of those cases, if I'm not mistaken, they were with young but adult-age siblings, so siblings that may not have really been able to get through the family reunification process necessarily, but that the youth really wanted to go and live with, and so they took off and moved in and lived with their older siblings. Then we had 2 who were reunited with family, and then 1 individual whose case was kind of an unusual scenario, situation rather, where it seemed that the child may have entered and was over 18 at the point that they entered the program, and there was just sort of a discrepancy in how old the child was. And once it was determined that they had come in over 18, then they had to be discharged or terminated from the program. So overall, we thought these were actually very positive outcomes. And anecdotally, in some of the studies and some of the research that's being done on U.S. domestic children who have been trafficked or commercially sexually exploited who are in foster care, it seems that some of their outcomes are not just not as positive. That there are quite a few instances where the youth are running away and getting back into what could be very dangerous or exploitative situations again. And so we thought these were generally positive, and so we looked back at, again, some of those adaptations like reducing the number of placement moves, which helps people form more connections with the other residents or the families in their programs. We also, our URM programs have relatively small caseloads for the case managers compared to a mainstream traditional foster care program. And we think that's a real positive, that it just enables each case manager who's working on these cases to spend a little more time with each individual child, to be more available for the foster families, to be more available for the youth, and to just be able to be more kind of invested in the case and have more one-to-one. And then again, the efforts that these programs make to help form positive relationships in the community, that's sort of a performance indicator for them. And so it's having a real benefit to the youth that are in the program, that there is this explicit effort to connect the youth to their larger communities. Okay, so those were some of the more quantitative or kind of point-in-time indicators. We also did some interviews where we wanted to get some qualitative data. So we interviewed program staff and we interviewed foster parents. And so by interviewing the program staff, case managers, foster family recruiters, if there were in-house therapeutic folks or like clinicians, some of them were youth development like recreational activity type staff people. We interviewed as many of them as we could. And really the crux of our questioning had to do with how were these child victims of trafficking different from the refugee asylee cases, and you know, what did you all do a little differently to accommodate or adapt to them? And so we asked about, you know, how did they recruit families? How did they train the families to prepare them for these youth? What were the characteristics of the families that did really well serving these trafficked children? And what kind of you know, selection process was made when it came to staffing these? Like how did they decide which case managers took these cases? And we also asked about, you know, their perceptions of the youth, whether they had more extreme or more unique therapeutic or behavioral needs, whether they felt that they were able to be safe in their communities, did they have to work with law enforcement, and how did that go? What other community partners did they need? And then we asked it again. We asked again about how they were adapting. And so some of the areas that they mentioned came back to foster parent training and support. And all of the program's staff said that we sort of handpicked the families that we placed the youth with. And then there's a very deliberate extra kind of training and extra support that they provide to those families. And so it's not random. It's not whoever has space or the right, you know, combination of space in their home. It was much more thoughtful and deliberate. The same with the case managers, that they generally placed these cases with the more experienced case managers who'd been with the program longer. Supervisors were more engaged and did more staffing on these cases. They did more home visits, more frequent check-ins, certainly more monitoring of the youth's social media, cell phone communication with family. Some of these programs mentioned that in these youth cases, if they had family, they had all of the calls to family take place at the office rather than in the foster home or through something like a personal cell phone. And then a lot more attention to the family relationships and just being much more, not just vigilant, but much more engaged in and meeting either by phone or in person with the family, just to make sure that that there were healthy relationships and expectations both directions. And then for the foster families, we also interviewed many of the, not interviewed by phone, but did an online survey of many of the foster parents who we knew had these trafficked children in their homes at one point or another, whether during the study period or before that we actually did the study. And we were asking them about, you know, how did they help these youth feel safe? How did they, how were they trained? What kind of support did they receive? Did they feel like they were bonding with the youth? And again, how were they different really than the other youth that they had served in the program? 61% said they did get extra training, specialized training on trafficking. 67% felt they had adequate training. Those aren't great numbers, we'll be honest. I mean, obviously you'd like those to be higher. But 72% really felt like they had bonded with the family, with the child, and the child felt bonded to their family, and that 78% did feel supported by the foster care program. So those aren't bad numbers. Obviously, we'd like to see them higher. And then what we did is we just sort of took everyone's recommendations, everyone's suggestions to see, you know, what was it that worked well, what was it that, you know, made these cases kind of stand out and be a little different than the typical refugee or asylee or Cuban Haitian cases. And some of it had to do, again, here with the criminal investigation, and there needed to be a very thoughtful approach to the criminal cases, and whether it was in the child's interest, if the child wanted to pursue a criminal investigation, participate in an investigation, why and why not. Again, there's some benefits in, you know, getting justice, and that can be very empowering, in getting immigration benefits or other kinds of benefits, accessing services that are only available to victims of crime, for example. And then for these foreign national youth, certainly the ability to bring in their families if they felt that their families were at risk because of their own trafficking or cooperation with law enforcement. Of course, there's some downsides that have to be considered and need to be explained to the youth, which include the idea preparing them for the idea that they'll have to tell their story many times, most likely, and sometimes in a public setting. They may have to face the trafficker in court. It can be very time-consuming, and that the amount of visits, or there'll be these intense periods of working with law enforcement, then many months of nothing, and then suddenly it's back and you're kind of back in the case again. The other thing that is really critical is the perception of how the child is behaving, and there's a real increased scrutiny in all of the child's actions and behaviors throughout this period. And I think the youth need to be prepared for that. Certainly the staff should be aware of this. For example, if a child was a victim of sex trafficking and there's a criminal investigation and working towards a prosecution, the defense attorneys who are defending those traffickers, those perpetrators, are going to look for bad behavior, similar behavior, whether it's engaging in substance abuse, drugs, or alcohol, running away, having a lot of boyfriends. Those kinds of behaviors can be used against a child by saying, my client didn't force the child to do these things. This is what they like to do. This is how they behaved before my client came along. This is how they're behaving now. So those kind of extra scrutiny can just be very stressful for teenagers and certainly youth who are coming out of these experiences and are trying to move through things like substance abuse and moving towards more healthy relationships and better self-esteem. So those are very real considerations to have. If you do have a youth that is going to move forward with a criminal investigation, cooperate with law enforcement, it's really important that there's an adult who is the main point of contact that can be kind of the agency, or the one person at the agency ideally should be the main point of contact for all of the prosecutors and the victim service coordinators from the law enforcement entity. It's really important that that person set ground rules about access to the child and really think about the child's interest in not disrupting their schedule, not pulling them out of school, but also thinking about, how the child reacts after having to recount their story. And so thinking about, do I want to have an appointment with law enforcement on a Monday, which is when my child is already struggling just because they're not really, happy with school. It's already kind of a rough day, and then that maybe isn't the day to then pile on with an uncomfortable conversation with law enforcement where they have to recount details of their trauma. You want to make sure that there is an attorney working on behalf of the child and protecting the child's interests. And that before sharing a lot of information about the child's behavior or changes in the child's status, you want to run things like that past the attorney who's representing the child's interests. And then make sure that if law enforcement makes promises to the youth that they'll get something, we'll help bring your mom over, we'll help bring your little brother and sister, you can get these VOCA funds. If they make those promises, it's important that they're held to that and that they're that the law enforcement folks follow through with that. Again, I will mention this that, and these are adolescents, and so this stuff is always important, but certainly if there is a criminal investigation, it is important that the child's behavior is, to the degree possible above board, and that if the child is engaging in high risk or dangerous behavior or illegal behavior, that's something that needs to be raised immediately with their attorney. It may need to be raised with law enforcement, certainly, because that needs to be managed. That information needs to be managed. You don't want that popping up if they are arrested for something, a statutory, truancy, or being out late, or being in a car with an open alcoholic container with someone. If they get a criminal charge, defense attorneys will certainly see that and use that against them in court. So just be very vigilant. engage the child's therapist if they have one, certainly, on these kinds of behaviors, just to help sort of walk through with the child, how to really be very cautious and very careful. It's a good idea if you are working with law enforcement that you have relationships with them before you're in the sort of intensity of a prosecution. It's good if the youth can have a relationship with whoever the key law enforcement people are that's beyond just them being interviewed or depositions. And some good practice that we've had law enforcement take some of our youth for lunch off and on, just so that they have some time that they spend together that isn't this very intense review of their trafficking exploitation history. It's good to be very clear up front about what your professional standards are, what can you share, what can you not share ethically because of your role as a clinician, case manager, program director, so that there aren't these unexpected, unmet expectations, and that was awkward. But if you don't tell law enforcement that you will never share particular information, then the one time that they want that from you and you're like, oh, I couldn't possibly share that with you, they can be very disappointed. And vice versa. There are probably pieces of information that you might want that they can't share, and it's just good to know that up front so that in the moment when you want the information, that's not the first time you're hearing that it can't be shared. Definitely set boundaries about when to contact, what's an emergency, when should they contact you after hours, and when should they not. That's really helpful just to protect everyone's boundaries. Safety planning with these youth, this was another area that came up over and over again in our interviews, both with the case managers and with the foster family, through the foster family survey, which is that it's really important to safety plan for these youth. The whole goal of the safety plan is to provide some structure, reduce uncertainty, so that when instances arise, when incidents arise, people know what to expect. And so it's important to think about a safety plan as being something that that regulates, if you will, the child's behavior, the youth's behavior, but also everybody else's behavior, so that the consequence for a youth infraction is also predictable. And so if there are rules about how a child should or shouldn't behave, then the consequences need to also be laid out, and that way a foster parent will react in the same way to the same infraction, no matter whatever the circumstances or how angry they are. Because if the child is expected to behave in a predictable way and there's predictable consequences, it's really only fair that the adults as well. And so an adult can't respond to the same infraction very differently one day than another day, because that kind of uncertainty and unpredictability isn't helpful for the youth. And so you want to make sure that everybody is taking the responsibility and following their consequences, and that there's a relationship, ideally, that that can help people using the safety plan as a base to talk about these, potential conflicts, or to talk through conflicts, and to help, prepare better responses that everybody is more agreeable to. So if a youth breaks a rule and they don't like the consequence, they can maybe negotiate a different kind of consequence for breaking a rule that still is a consequence, but isn't something that just sort of escalates the conflict rather than de-escalate. Obviously, it should be strengths-based. We try to talk about not just making a list of things that you can't do, like you can't do this, you can't do that, especially if that list is based on past indiscretions, past bad choices. If it's just a list of things that they've done in the past you don't want them to keep doing, that kind of safety plan is very critical. It can feel really critical. It can feel like just a list of everything you've done wrong that we're not forgetting that you did. And so that's a really negative place to start. So we try and recommend that safety plans emphasize prevention, and so not just have a consequence, but have an alternate response. So if a youth feels angry, instead of saying like you can't slam doors, perhaps in the safety plan it was like, when you're angry, instead of saying don't slam doors, you would say like you can ask for a timeout and you can go into the backyard or something. I mean, that's a very low level, but the idea that you are helping the youth come up with alternate responses, alternate behaviors, as opposed to more negative or self-destructive behaviors. Talking through the consequences and help the youth make the connection so that they can recognize what are the inappropriate behaviors, inappropriate responses can be really helpful. And then certainly to think of these as a dynamic document. And so a safety plan should be evolving over time, and youth should be allowed to gain more responsibility, more autonomy as they demonstrate their ability to make good choices and be responsible and manage their behaviors. Okay, again, you want to make sure that the safety plan, again, involves everybody and involves everyone's behaviors. Again, consequences. Again, it should be dynamic. And one of the other areas that we have emphasized as a good practice as well is to have other people in the residence talk about the safety plan and how it impacts them and why it might be important to them. And this is especially helpful in group care settings, so maybe not a traditional foster family placement, but if it's an independent living program, or it's a group care setting, or it's a home with teaching parents and there's multiple youth, it can be really helpful to have the youth share with each other how each other's behavior impacts them, and so why there need to be consequences against certain kinds of behavior. And we had a great example at one time in a program I worked with where one of the youth was often sneaking out at night and meeting up with people, and then they would come back in. And the other youth, and so that of course the teaching parents were like, that's, it's really unsafe. It's you're putting yourself at all this risk, and so there was that. But it was actually more helpful for the other youth in the home to say, I don't feel safe when you do that because I don't know who's going to follow you back. And and I'm concerned about my own personal safety. And it was just a little bit, I think, easier for the youth to relate to each other's feelings rather than the parents, teaching parents, sort of, explaining why it's dangerous. So that's possible when you're in a kind of more group care and everyone's kind of older and more peer levels. Okay, and then finally, the other area that came up over and over again, where these cases, these trafficked youth cases were very different than the refugee youth, was this establishing family or reestablishing family relationships. Several of the youth had family in the U.S., which would be the case for a U.S. citizen child, certainly. And so it's really important to understand, what was the family's role? Did they facilitate? Were they complicit? Did they inadvertently, through neglect or their own bad choices and bad relationships, contribute to the trafficking, or are they in some ways just as much victims, or if not victims, at risk and not part of the problem, but their safety concerns need to be considered as well. So it's just important to really explore that and to take the time and to invest in that kind of exploration. And then about the perceptions of the family about that child as a result of the trafficking. Are they blaming the child? Are they ashamed of the child's behavior? And those can be barriers and that can be worked through, maybe through family counseling, through group therapy. But those are some real red flags that you don't want to reunify a child with a family that views them in such a negative light as a result of their victimization, and that it's really important that the parents or whoever the caregiver is going to be really understand how to be supportive, non-judgmental, non-blaming, and really understand the complexity of the trafficking and how a child may have ended up coerced into that situation. The other thing is thinking about what the child's role is going to be in the family and whether the family's expectation matches what the child will be able to do. And we've had, for example, if a family envisions and they want the child to sort of come back and be the child again, if the child really has, youth has really moved into much more of an adult role, then the family needs to understand that they are not going to come back and be a 12 or 13-year-old again. And so again, unmet expectations can lead to a lot of conflict. And so making sure the family is thinking about how the child will fit in to the family, whether it's as an adult or as a child, whether there's an expectation perhaps that the child will be much more independent, and some families, well, you're on your own, now you're on your own. And so just, again, really exploring that with families, exploring that with the child, and making sure that, that either there can be a good positive consensus, or if not, that the child understands how to be self-protective, how to look out for their interests, their feelings, how to have good boundaries, how to have a relationship, but still, quite frankly, look out for themselves. So these are the areas that we found came up with the trafficking youth in particular that seemed, again, to stem from the kind of exploitation they experienced, the very personal nature of human trafficking, the fact that traffickers often break down the self-esteem and the self-worth of their victims. That's how they can maintain control, the manipulation of relationships. And so all of that has to be dealt with. It has to be really unpacked, and the youth need help moving through and beyond that. So that was what we learned from our study. Hopefully it would be helpful for anyone working with youth in a residential program, home-based, even I think with youth returning home to their families. Some of this might be really helpful. You can certainly, through BRYCS, access the full report that we wrote up of our study. And now I will answer questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Hillary. Once again, if you do have questions, please use the chat box on the left. We do have a few minutes to answer additional questions. And if we don't get to your questions, we will bring those over to the BRYCS blog.
So there's a question about the emotional connection to adults. How was it assessed? So we assessed it in two ways. One way you might all laugh at, and that is that in this monthly form that the case managers had to complete for each youth in their program, there was quite simply a question that said, like, has the youth made a positive connection with an adult, yes or no? And so while that's kind of a little awkward, it was helpful because it sort of did really keep that as an indicator, as something that the case managers needed to be sort of vigilant and pay attention to, because they had to report on it. We also asked that of the case managers themselves, and then we also looked through the case notes and the case files, and sometimes you could infer from case notes, if there were some of the youth really just were really active in church youth groups, in sport teams. Some of the youth were engaged in the ethnic communities that they were from through the Adult Refugee Program. And so that would be, that kind of activity would be mentioned over and over and over again in the case notes, and sometimes some of the programs had mentoring programs, and so there would be case notes about, whether that was going well or not with the youth. So we kind of, we used those three different sources of data, and then we just kind of, to be honest, then sort of really distilled it down to yes or no, and who that kind of categorizing the person. And again, I think the fact that they had to report on it did strengthen that as a program service goal, if you will. And so I think that the programs did a good job. Again, 40% of the kids either it was clear that they didn't have an adult connection, and in some cases, that was clear in the case notes that there were concerns that the children weren't connecting. in other cases, it just was really vague, and so it really wasn't provided in those three. So that, I mean, we suspect that maybe it wasn't happening, and that's why it wasn't being recorded. But I think it's just, I don't know if there's a way to strengthen it beyond just being very deliberate about that, being deliberate about creating opportunities, being deliberate about in some ways presenting a range of people that the youth can connect with, and then just seeing where they click, and then certainly documenting when it's working well, and certainly when it isn't. I think those would be my only really suggestions there.
Okay, we have an additional question here. Just to clarify, the graph showing the relationship between trauma versus time in trafficking situation, it appears that the shorter the time in the situation, the more trauma. Is that interpreted correct?
Oh, I think that was this is simply the days in trafficking. And so the frequency there are the number of kids. And so 10 kids were trafficked between 0 and 90 days. Then 5 kids were in their trafficking situation between 90 and 180 days. So it's a histogram that's just showing, how many kids were trafficked for these slivers of days in trafficking. There's no we don't have trauma reflected anywhere in this. We were just making perhaps an assumption that the longer kids were trafficked, the more likely trauma they would have experienced, and that would impact their kind of recovery. Yeah. And I will say, and I'll be honest, I do suspect, and I'm not remembering perfectly, but one of these 2 youth that are the kind of outliers there that were trafficked, more than 1,400, more than 1,800 days, that's several years. One of those was one of the youth that had the either the 8 or the 12 placement changes. And so we did have a couple of almost anecdotal associations where some kids that were at that end of this histogram were also didn't do well in some of our other measures of well-being, like the stability and
Okay, well, thank you, Hillary.
Thank you.
We have our information up here as far as how you can contact us. Please check out our website if you have not already. If you have additional questions about this topic or anything else that you encounter in your day-to-day work, you can email us at info@brycs.org or contact us via phone at our toll-free number. And then also please join us on Facebook, Twitter, and our blog spot if you are able. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you can join future webinars.